Under the law of Moses, what would happen if a woman had an unusual discharge of blood? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Leviticus on Walking Through the Bible.
Glory of His cross.
If you have a Bible with you, turn to Leviticus chapter 15. We're going to be reading from verses 25 to 33. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Leviticus chapter 15, beginning at verse 25. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, other than at the time of her customary impurity, or if it runs beyond her usual time of impurity, all the days of her unclean discharge shall be as the days of her customary impurity. She shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies all the days of her discharge shall be to her as the bed of her impurity, and whatever she sits on shall be unclean as the uncleanness of her impurity. Whoever touches those things shall be unclean. He shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. But if she is cleansed of her discharge, then she shall count for herself 7 days, and after that she shall be clean. And on the 8th day she shall take for herself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, and bring them to the priest, to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Then the priest shall offer to the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, and the priest shall make atonement for her before the Lord for the discharge of her uncleanness. Thus you shall separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness when they defile my tabernacle that is among them. In our last lesson, we were talking about uncleanness that arose from a woman's monthly menstrual cycle. Again, as with other uncleanness, it did not mean that the woman had sinned by having her monthly menstrual cycle, for such is a necessary part of life. It meant that because menstrual blood flowed from her, and that she didn't have the modern conveniences to prevent this from defiling her clothes or anything she sat on, that she would be unclean and unable to go into the tabernacle of meeting to offer sacrifices, nor have people touch her. This might seem cruel, but in cases where men were unclean under the law, the same thing applied to them. So God isn't centering out women as unclean, while men as always being clean. Coming now to verse 25. What we have here are discharges of blood that occur at other times than her menstrual cycle, or if her menstrual cycle runs longer than usual. What would happen then? The same thing that happened if a man had such a discharge. She would be unclean. Everything she lied on would be unclean. Everything she sat on would be unclean, just as it was in the days of her menstruation. Anyone who touched her or any of the things that she touched were unclean, becoming unclean until evening, and had to wash his clothes and himself. Do we ever see this happening anywhere in the Bible? Yes, for recall that there was a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years that we studied thus far in Matthew 9 and Mark 5. Think about this. She would be unclean under the law of Moses for 12 years. Nobody could touch her or anything she sat on or laid on, or they would become unclean. She couldn't go into the temple to offer sacrifices to God, even though she may have wanted to. No sin sacrifices, no burnt offerings, no peace offerings, no trespass offerings or grain offerings. Being unclean under the law was very inconvenient, but imagine being unclean for 12 years. No wonder this woman was determined just to touch the hem of Jesus' garment in order to be healed. She was desperate and in faith acted, which is why Jesus didn't chastise her for her actions, telling her to be happy, for her faith had made her well. That story is an amazing story when we read it in the Gospels, but it becomes even more amazing when we understand how the law of Moses would have dealt with this woman. What was the woman to do when the flow of blood stopped? The same thing that a man had to do when he had a discharge. She had to count 7 days from when the flow of blood stopped, and then she would be clean. On the 8th day, she had to go to the tabernacle of meeting, along with 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. One of them would be offered as a sin offering, and one would be offered as a burnt offering to make atonement for her. Yes, she may not have sinned in this regard, but all the days of her uncleanness meant she couldn't offer sacrifices, so whatever sin she committed in that time needed to be atoned for. Now, we must realize the situation we're talking about here concerning this sacrifice requirement was not her monthly menstrual cycle. Therefore, she would not have to offer these sacrifices once per month. She would only have to offer this sacrifice for the discharge of blood described beginning at verse 25, the abnormal discharge. Thus, God was not placing a burden on young women that each month they had to do this. The chapter concludes by telling us that the purpose of these laws again was to show the children of Israel the necessity of recognizing uncleanness so that they did not defile the tabernacle with that uncleanness. God is a holy God and must not be approached by those who are unclean under the law. In our next lesson, we're going to be leaving the rather uncomfortable and somewhat grotesque discussions of the last few chapters and move on to an important day in the Hebrew calendar, the Day of Atonement. With that, our time is up for today. Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Leviticus chapter 16, verses 1 to 10, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.